And I don't think anyone in Canada or the United States or Britain would say, well, let's have a dictatorship because it seemed to work in Singapore. So what lessons can we actually learn? Well,
Right.
I think the lessons we can learn are the old established lessons that incentives matter.
Hello and welcome to the Realities of Socialism podcast. I'm your host, Rosemarie Fike, and today we're going to be talking about Singapore. In the Realities of Socialism podcast, in some episodes, we try to understand what life was really like in traditional socialist societies, how these countries started down the path towards socialism, and what factors might have made them decide to end their experiment with central planning. But in today's episode, we're going to talk about a country that really never quite fits the traditional definition of socialism, but they do have some centrally planned aspects to their economy. And I think they can offer us some important lessons when we're thinking about other economies and policy conversations that we might want to have. So in this conversation, I'm joined by Dr. Stephen Globerman. Steve is a senior fellow in the Addington Chair in Measurement at the Fraser Institute. He's the author of over 200 articles and monographs, and he's served a really pivotal role in editing many of the books and contributing to these books in the Realities of Socialism series. So we're going to be talking about Singapore as discussed in the book Meritocracy, Personal Responsibility, and Encouraging Investment, Lessons from Singapore's Economic Growth Miracle, which was co-authored with many of Fraser Institute's excellent scholars, Brian Chang, Bacchus Barua, Jake Fuss, Paige McPherson, and Mackenzie Moir. Steve, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about Singapore and what unique features that they have to their economy and what aspects of their economy or what aspects of their institutions have put them on a path to be considered one of the Asian growth miracles.
Okay. Good to be with you.
So I always like to start these conversations by talking about what socialism is, how we define socialism, and in this case, try to understand a little bit about why we would be talking about Singapore, a country that ranks number one in the Fraser Institute's most recent edition of the Economic Freedom of the World Index. Why would we be talking about Singapore in a podcast that is exploring the reality of socialism?
Yeah. So for the purposes of our project on realities of socialism, we see socialism and capitalism as being along a continuum where the feature that distinguishes where a country is going to be on the continuum is how much of economic decision making is done by politicians and bureaucrats and how much is done by private sector participants. And obviously, you're not going to find a country which is completely on one side or the other of that particular spectrum. Of course, the Eastern European countries in this series are quite well along towards the socialist end of the spectrum. But Singapore has some unique features that are partially socialism, but primarily free market. So what is the socialist part of the Singapore economic institutional setup? Well, the government has traditionally played a role via its industrial policies. Specifically, it's made investments in private, commercial corporations. It's provided subsidies to specific companies to make investments in Singapore. To that extent, the government, politicians, and bureaucrats are directing economic activity, which would, and some people do say, well, Singapore is really a socialist country for that reason. But on the other hand, much of the economic activity in Singapore is really directed by traditional capitalist institutions. For example, a strong protection of private property rights, an emphasis on efficiency and profitability, low taxes to encourage productivity. And so, at the end of the day, Singapore is perhaps a unique case of partial, let's call it socialism by my definition, but primarily still capitalism.
So Singapore has a pretty interesting history. It only became a sovereign state in 1965. Can you maybe talk a little bit about its history? And I know a portion of the book you talk about the legacy of British rule. And so can you talk a little bit about what Singapore looked like pre-independence versus post-independence and what that British legacy really is?
So Singapore became an independent city-state in 1965, and to put their economic growth experience in context, in 1961, Singapore's real gross domestic product per capita, which is standard way that economists measure standard of living. So Singapore's real GDP per capita in 1961 was approximately 20% of real GDP per capita in the United States, which is really the standard of a country's high standard of living. By 2020, Singapore's real GDP per capita was really virtually identical to the US real GDP per capita. So enormous, really historical growth experience for Singapore. And as you say, Singapore is one of the Asian tigers. All of them achieved remarkable growth over that period. But beyond growth, Singapore also had other macroeconomic performance, exceptionalism, lowest inflation rate amongst the Asian tigers, highest employment rate, percentage of population employed. I mean, just in total, a truly impressive economic performance. Now, as you mentioned, Singapore did not start from a dead stop. It inherited British institutions such as an independent court system, protection of property rights, commitment to free trade, which certainly was background help for the country's growth, but it could have certainly been reversed. There was no guarantee that those institutions were going to be maintained and carried through. And Singapore had its own particular innovations in governance, economic governance, that assisted its growth. So altogether, a very interesting story.
And so they've had, since their independence, the book talks about their growth rates are 4.4% on average, which doesn't sound like much, but that's a very high rate of economic growth. And that they have a top-notch workforce, right? The World Bank's Human Capital Index ranks Singapore's workforce as some of the healthiest, most well-educated. It's a very highly productive workforce, and a strong commitment to openness, sound institutional quality. You have a really great quote in the book from the Minister of Trade and Industry, Chan Chun Sing, where he says, while we continue to strengthen external linkages domestically, we are also ensuring that Singapore remains a conducive place for doing business. Our pro-business policies, sound legal and regulatory system, and robust intellectual property protections provide certainty to businesses to foster innovation. And so this seems like if I were wanting to start a business, open a business, Singapore would be a pretty attractive place for me to go. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about, some of the economic policies that makes it so attractive to somebody who might want to be doing business?
Yes. Well, part of it is certainly captured in the quote you just mentioned. Openness to trade and investment is certainly a major feature, particularly foreign direct investment. Singapore's growth story, really part of what has to be mentioned is, as we just discussed, human capital, that is education and health of the workforce, which makes for a productive workforce, but also um, physical and intellectual property investment. And Singapore, by opening up to both foreign direct investment and trade, promotes physical capital investment and intellectual property investment. Those multinational companies that set up in Singapore brought with them technology and other intellectual property assets, which help Singapore's growth. But I want to just step back and emphasize that really the underlying commitment to economic growth is certainly is it sounds like a tautology, but it's not. It is part of the growth story. Um, when you think about all of the levers that the government used to develop the economy, it was a pretty pristine commitment to economic growth. In many countries, and Canada right now as a case in point, many countries employ industrial policy, that is, government policies to try and encourage investment. Right now in Canada, lots of government subsidies are going to create quote unquote clean energy businesses, EV assembly plants and battery plants. Well, okay, that's fine as it goes, but the overlay is that the government is also using subsidies to create union high paying jobs, which raises the costs of those businesses. It wants those plants built in particular locations, which may or may not be the most efficient places to locate those businesses. When you have policies that mix goals, that is, mix economic and social goals, the chances are the policies are not going to work. There's a rule of thumb in dynamic economic systems that you need as many policies as policy goals. Well, if your policy goal is growth, but you're leveraging a whole bunch of other priorities along with growth, you're probably not going to get any of them satisfied. Singapore was committed to growing the economic pie because the Singapore government believed that social goals were best attained by growing the pie, not redistributing the pie. And that's an important part of the story.
I definitely want to get into that part of the story as well, because one of the things that really jumped out about Singapore's story is that they want to foster a culture where people take responsibility for themselves, and so that plays a role in how their social institutions have come to look like. So I definitely want to talk a little bit about that, but I would love to hear your thoughts on, you mentioned that there is this commitment to freedom and property rights and competition, but on the other hand, they do have some interventionist policies, particularly when it comes to industries. There's a little bit of putting their thumb on the scale, subsidizing certain industries. Can you talk about, what aspects of the economy have more of a centrally planned process to them? What are these industries looking like? The book mentions government linked corporations. What does that mean, and how do we ensure that that they are still paying attention to opportunity costs and acting competitive in the way that private companies have an incentive to do?
Right. Well, at various points in time, different industries became higher priorities, and the growth model in Singapore, which is not really dramatically different from the growth process in other Asian tigers, was to try and cultivate light manufacturing, and then move on to a more of the financial and technology oriented industries. and really moving up the value chain, which is a traditional growth model for developing economies. One industry where the government was virtually dominant is in housing construction. Most of the housing in Singapore was developed by government housing agency. Um, well, so what? Why does it seem to have worked in Singapore? That, as you put it, government putting its thumb on the scales. Well, again, I want to go back to the point that there were still a lot of institutions that were conducive to competition and efficiency. And again, I want to emphasize the commitment to growth and efficiency. That when the government was putting its thumb on the scale, was making its commitment to growth. Um, and as I mentioned, that meant that the managers of those government-linked corporations were expected to manage them as profit maximizing organizations, and they were rewarded on the basis of performance, and no direct subsidies, and there was no protectionism. So that's important. That's important to emphasize. Um, the other part of the story is the bureaucracy, the Singapore bureaucracy, which must be acknowledged as being one, perhaps the outstanding transparency story. It's acknowledged that it's a well managed bureaucracy, if you can imagine that, and the bureaucrats in Singapore again are rewarded on the basis of, well, did you achieve your policy goals? If you said you wanted to create an efficient performing organization in this sector, did you achieve that goal? Singapore's bureaucrats are, in some sense, almost like private sector executives. They're paid on the basis of their perceived performance. Those are unique features. Now, at the end of the day, what we conclude is that one can make the argument that the government putting its thumb on the scale, well, it contributed to part of the success story. On the other hand, it's possible to say that, well, things might have been even better had government been less intrusive in terms of its industrial policy. But what I want to emphasize is that Singapore's industrial policy looks much different from industrial policy in other Western developed countries.
And I think that is important to mention. One of the things that I think really jumped out in what you were saying is the commitment to incentivizing people's performance. I know in the book it goes into a bit of detail about the educational system, but one thing I remember reading is that there's really high quality teachers in their educational system because they're paid competitive rates, and there are incentives that if the students perform well, the schools and the teachers have financial incentives. So incentives seem to matter, and that seems to be a message that Singapore has taken seriously from economists, and really, at least in trying to structure their economic and social system, they've tried to really acknowledge the importance of incentivizing people to perform. So I would love to talk a little bit about some of their personal welfare type of systems, so their income support system or their healthcare system, because those, when people talk about a modern conception of socialism, people think about a country that provides kind of a safety net for its citizens. So what does that look like in Singapore? What kind of safety nets do they have in place? How are they funded? What makes them unique compared to the rest of the developed world?
Yes. So the The Singapore model for delivering social services does not, again, it doesn't exclude government. Government does have a role to play. But let me talk about personal savings accounts, because that really is, while it's not unique to Singapore, there are other countries that employ that particular framework for delivering social services. Singapore goes much further than other countries. So personal savings accounts are literally savings accounts that are owned by individuals who contribute through payroll taxes. So employers and employees contribute um, approximately 27% to personal savings accounts. And these savings accounts are then used to fund education, higher education, healthcare, housing, retirement, and unemployment benefits. The government does have safety nets around these personal savings accounts. So, the obvious question someone would ask is, well, what happens if someone is a low income worker, doesn't have much in their personal savings accounts, and then has a major medical event and they can't pay for it? Well, the government does have safety nets that will ensure that uh, personal savings accounts are sufficient to meet medical needs, to provide unemployment support if it's needed. But the important feature in Singapore is that, for example, if you're going to receive support for unemployment insurance, you're expected to be looking for a job. If you're not active in the workforce looking for a job, you're not going to be eligible for that safety net. And if you're not able to get employment because of a skill issue, you're expected to go and get retraining. So this gets back to the point you were making earlier, and it goes throughout the story of Singapore. Is there is a very strong social commitment to personal responsibility, and a real taboo against free riding and becoming a ward of the state. And so while the government is providing these social safety nets, the expectation is you're going to do everything within your capabilities to make yourself self-sufficient. And what this means, a couple of things. The personal savings accounts do a number of things. Number one, they enable the government to keep taxes low in terms of general taxes. Corporate tax rates and individual tax rates are very low in Singapore compared to elsewhere. Well, what does that do? That gets back to your point about creating incentives to produce output, to be efficient, to increase your income, increase your skills through education so you can make more income, because you're going to keep a large part of that incremental gain in your income.
Yeah.
That's one important benefit of these personal saving accounts. The other is you have control of how you're spending your own, let's call it your own human capital. In this case, creating financial capital. If you want to spend more on healthcare and less on housing, you can do that. As distinct from the government saying, "Oh, you know, we're single payers of healthcare. The amount of healthcare you get is how much we're willing to supply you. The amount of unemployment insurance you get is how much we're willing to supply you." There's the ability of people to essentially manage their life cycle of savings in a way they find most beneficial. Again, part of the whole ethic of personal responsibility.
It is a forced savings account, right? So I think in the book it talks about you're required to save at least 20% of your monthly income if you're under 55 years old of age. And I know that there's probably some cutoffs if you're making a lower income, lower paying job, or if you're unemployed. But that's a significant contribution, right? 20%, that's a fifth of your take home pay. But as you say, there's a lot of flexibility over how that can be used. It doesn't need to just be used for retirement. It could be for housing, it could be for education, it could be for unemployment assistance. Um, so one thing that is mentioned in the book, though, is a criticism of the Singaporean system is that too many people fall through the cracks. What does that mean? And does that translate to high poverty rates, or what does it mean that people are falling through that there are people falling through the cracks? Is that a valid criticism?
Well, this is a fairly, as I understand it, a fairly recent criticism. At least, certainly, it is intensifying in recent years. Um, this is all relative. What does falling through the cracks mean? Does it literally mean that the poverty rate in Singapore is substantially higher than it is elsewhere? My understanding is that the answer to that is no. And in fact, the income distribution in Singapore, if you look at it through kind of standard measures of income disparity, the income distribution in Singapore is no less equal than it is in Canada or the United States. I think the the concern about falling through the cracks, as I say, is a relative one. It's not absolute poverty. It's that as Singapore has become, let's just say, it's a wealthy city state. It's a wealthy country. Um, it's more obvious that some people have have quite high standards of living relative to other people, and this is a concern of certainly of certain poverty activist groups. But again, and partly this is. I can't claim to have a lot of personal experience with Singapore's social conditions, but um, Singapore's government is unique in the sense of really discouraging antisocial behavior. So things like homelessness are not going to be obvious in Singapore because the government simply is going to tolerate it. And so to say, well, are people falling through the cracks? Um, this is going to be a subtle argument because you're not going to see the social dysfunctions that you might see in other countries.
Yeah, because I was looking at all of the outcomes that you talk about, all of the development outcomes that are talked about in the book. And, Singapore has really high rates of home ownership and really long life expectancies. And so all of these, quality of life indicators that economists tend to pay a lot of attention to, at least on most of them, Singapore looks pretty great. So I'm reading this quote that there's a concern that people are falling through the cracks, and I wanted to know what was I missing in just looking at all of the good outcomes that Singapore has been able to achieve. I would like to turn a little bit to the healthcare system. Speaking of health outcomes and people in Singapore having some of the longest life expectancies, what does their healthcare system look like? It's a universal healthcare system, but universal healthcare systems look different from country to country. So, how is Singapore's system funded? What does the quality of their healthcare system look like?
So it's partly a government-funded system in that there is a basic healthcare plan that is funded by government, but the personal savings accounts are also available for use to purchase healthcare services in private hospitals, private healthcare clinics. So there's a basic provision of healthcare insurance, which makes it a universal healthcare country. I mean, no one in Singapore is going to go without healthcare. Even if you don't have personal savings accounts, there's a government plan that's going to be in place, and everyone draws on some of that basic government provided health insurance. But then there is this overlay of the personal savings, which also can be used to provide care. The performance of the healthcare system is, to be candid, is a bit mixed. As you mentioned, longevity is one of the best among the developed countries, OECD countries. Mortality rates are low as a consequence. There's probably a mixed performance in that you can look at availability of inputs such as MRI machines, CAT scan machines, standardized for the population size. Singapore is somewhere in the middle. If you look at the top 30 countries, Singapore it's not at the top, it's not at the bottom, it's somewhere in the middle. If you look at performance measures such as cancer survival rates from heart attacks, Singapore does well on some metrics, not as well on others. So it's not a simple story to tell about the actual outcomes of the healthcare system. But the important point is that you don't have people in Singapore who are unable to attain what would be considered good healthcare outcomes.
So trying to think, what else have we not talked about with regard to Singapore's system that you think is interesting or would be something that we can draw lessons from?
Well, I think what's different and what makes it challenging to draw lessons from are Singapore's unique social and political institutions. Singapore is not a representative democracy in the way that Canadians, Americans, British people would acknowledge. Some people would characterize it as a soft, benevolent dictatorship.
Right. Singapore is the country that people bring up when they're talking about the Hayek-Friedman hypothesis that we can have economically free countries that are not really politically free, but we can't have the reverse. We can't have a politically free country that's not supported by economic freedom. People point to Singapore as the economically free country that is not democratic, not the same level of political freedom that we think of when we're talking about liberal democracies.
That's correct. And had the Singapore government set different priorities, we wouldn't be lauding the economic performance of Singapore. So the other feature is the social institutions, and that brings us back to meritocracy and personal responsibility. That there is an expectation that you're going to pull your weight economically, and that taking risks and making investments justify the rewards, the economic rewards that on the margin you're going to get from taking risks and making investments. So what does that mean? What can we take away from that? We're not going to, well, it's not reasonable to expect societies of Canada, US, et cetera, to completely change their social priorities in order to foster faster economic growth. That's really expecting too much. And I don't think anyone in Canada or the United States or Britain would say, well, let's have a dictatorship because it seemed to work in Singapore. So what lessons can we actually learn? Well,
right.
I think the lessons we can learn are the old established lessons that incentives matter, and that linking rewards to performance matters. And maybe most importantly, if we are going to have government playing a role in the economy, putting its thumb on the scale, that is, making decisions in place of private sector participant decision making, let's at least try to set up those political governance institutions so that the least amount of harm can be done, and maybe actually some good might be done.
And even though Singapore is not, the example of liberal democracy, it is committed to, has very low corruption. They do have good governance. So they are, to me, an example of, strong commitment to sound institutions and providing the incentives for people to be productive. And as you said, I think that's probably the best lesson that we could walk away with.
Yes.
Well, Steve, before we wrap up today, I wanted to ask if you had any recommendations for listeners who are interested in learning more about Singapore or other countries that are not quite socialist, but can give us some lessons about what economic institutions might be productive.
Yes, well, I strongly recommend that people go to the Fraser Institute website, where we're going to have all 5 of the volumes that have been produced, and those cover Poland, Estonia, Sweden, Denmark, and Singapore. And there are a variety of other assets that are going to be available on the website, including videos and podcasts, and op-eds and blog posts that develop both condense and develop the stories about these various varieties of socialism.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, for joining me today. I've learned a lot about Singapore. It's a very interesting case, and I hope listeners have learned a lot from you as well.
Thanks, Rosemarie.
Thanks for joining us for the Realities of Socialism podcast, where we take a deep dive into the consequences of socialism as it was imposed on tens of millions of people during the 20th century. For more information, including infographics, free books, and more podcast episodes, visit realitiesof socialism.org.